You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your five-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome, guests. It's just the two of us. We've been
Yeah, it's lonely.
freed from budget lockup. We're free again, free again. Geoff, how are you enjoying your freedom in the last hour here?
I'm really, really enjoying it because budget lockups, as we'll discuss in a minute, they sound glamorous and kind of special places where government stuff happens, but they can be tedious.
They can be, and so this morning on budget day, Geoff and I entered the lockup at the Victoria Conference Center probably just prior to 9 a.m. We submitted our phone in the whatever kind of bag it is, very secret bag, and we were cut off from the world for 4.5 hours. We could
Hmm.
not we could not check Instagram. We could not Snapchat with each other. We could not go on TikTok. We had to be like it was 1989 or something like that.
Well, the funny
Remember
thing
those
about
days?
I didn't go back quite that far, but the budget lockup was set up so that reporters could read the documents and then be ready to file the moment that the finance minister stood up in the House. But over the years, and I guess it's true elsewhere, but I've only been to a lockup in BC, they became kind of the peak event of the entire political season for a lot of stakeholders in the wider public sector and the private sector, plus a whole bunch of government relations specialists. And so you and I were there with that elite crowd.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
People throw tantrums to get access to that lockup, even if they don't really need to. But so now it's what, three floors or two floors and
Yeah.
several rooms at the convention center with a huge setup, all the deputy ministers available, media's all there, and all
Like
kinds of.
Lollapalooza for nerds, basically.
It really is. I've got a
It's
question
amazing who
for
they'll
the
let in
idiot.
there. I saw some people in there. I was thinking, how the heck did they get in there? Like they're, Bill Thielman. What was he doing there? Jeez.
Yeah, no, I
They'll
don't.
let anybody in.
Yeah, they even let in podcast broadcasters. That's how desperate they've become to round out the turnout.
Yes, in fact, for the YouTube viewers, I have my Hotel Pacifico budget lockup
Okay.
pass here. Geoff had it as well. We represent it proudly, the podcast, our podcast guests.
They,
Um,
they took our phones, Mike, but you can see here I have my lapel pin, which shows Canadian British Columbia solidarity in the face of the Trump threat. That was given out as a special gift today.
well, this was the bizarre timing of it all, is that as we were entering the lockup today, the tariff response from the Prime Minister and the Premier was happening in real time. So we were in a bit of a bubble, although we did have the Premier drop by the lockup to give his response to last night's, or I guess 12:01 this morning's imposition of tariffs. What do you make of the Premier's comments, Geoff?
You cut me off. I was just about to ask you what you make of them, but I think
No, you go first.
I wasn't sure how they landed because it was Premier Eby's a lawyer by training. He's very comfortable with the relentless addition of facts, the careful development of an argument, and it was a bit of a strange setting there with everybody there poised for the budget, and he came in to basically say, "Here's how here are a number of things I'm responding." We started with Ukraine, how
Yeah.
disorienting and terrible it is that the people of Ukraine wake up this morning to discover that the United States has shut down the pipeline of munitions they need, and then he turned to the situation in BC and made comments very similar to what he's made in the past. So interesting to see where it all goes. So far, BC's only announced some pretty modest measures like pulling American booze off the shelves, but I think there's more to come, and I'm curious to see what it is.
Yeah, I felt he was a bit lawyerly. I agree. I don't feel like I heard anything new this morning compared to what he's been saying over the last month,
Hmm.
which is fine. I guess he's consistent. But after the lockup, I turned on the national news, and Doug Ford, I felt, was really crisp.
Hmm.
And I'm seeing a news clip. I'm not seeing like we saw with Premier Eby this morning, 10 minutes or 15 minutes of him. I thought the Prime Minister actually was excellent today as well. He was very direct and very, clippable for the American news. So I think that was important. So we'll see how the Premier Eby adjusts in the days ahead and whether there's going to be any specific tactics that BC government rolls out. Ontario's talking about not exporting electricity. Is that
Hmm.
something we're going to consider doing? Because we need to import it too. So we got to be careful, right? We got to get the electricity from somewhere if we don't have an ample supply. And so we got to be, somewhat strategic here. But I think it's got to be more than just pulling bourbon off the shelves from red states. I
Well,
think
it's easy to hit a big tripwire because I was recalling way back in my political life when I was working for Glenn Clark, there was a lot of anger over the Pacific Salmon Treaty, which was
Mhm.
really biased in the Americans' favor. And so Glenn Clark undertook what we called in those days the Salmon War, which was an effort at the provincial level to try to force
Yeah.
a better deal and to shame Ottawa, frankly, into doing more. And without going into the whole salmon war, I will say that one thing that set off everybody was the suggestion that maybe it was time to close the Inside Passage, which is the waterway that is a lifeline for Alaska with all kinds of
Yeah.
and barge traffic up there. The Alaska Highway is another one. St.
Are you manifesting something here, Jeff? Are you
Well, I'm manifesting the anxiety that it caused internationally when somebody, a senior like the Premier of BC, said maybe it's time to do this. I don't think that anybody's thinking about doing that kind of thing in Ottawa,
didn't
but
didn't
it would
some
have an
boats in
impact.
Prince Rupert blockade an Alaska ferry
They
during Glenn
blockaded
Clark's?
Alaska Ferry, and
Yeah,
they're held to pay for that too.
yeah.
And so that we think about tariffs and money and stuff like that. There's a lot of physical traffic that goes back and forth that could be slowed or stopped by even minor administrative measures.
Yeah, they better be careful about that blockading thing because BC ferry route from Victoria to Tawasin actually goes through American waters every day. So
Well,
you don't want to have to go around.
it could detour,
That
but
could be a
anyway,
bit of a problem. But there was also Glenn Clark also he wasn't aimed at the US this time, but he also took action on the nuclear testing range at Nanoose Bay.
and then news, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and the federal government had to come in and expropriate the seabed to
Yeah, David
preserve that.
Anderson, a
So
local Victoria MLA, had his political career resuscitated by the Sound War, really. And there's a very famous cartoon by Bob Krieger, I think, of Anderson holding a fishing line that has Glenn Clark as the fish at the end of it. It was a 2-year war where Glenn Clark won round one, and people felt Anderson won the second round. But
well,
that was child's play, literally, compared to what we're into now.
we'll see if Glenn's part of the strategy and tactics team behind the scenes. That
Yeah.
would be pretty spicy. But I think we're in this position today because probably Canada's been pretty complacent about its relationship with the US. And along comes an unpredictable, mercurial bully as president of the United States, and all of a sudden we're scrambling big time. So I think all parties are guilty of that,
Mhm.
frankly, at the federal level. The Liberals have been in power for 10 years, and probably the relationship has been eroded with the US. You know, uh, the Conservatives, I think, well, many of them were cheering on Trump when he got elected. At least the polls tell us that about half of the conservative voter base liked it. I
Mhm.
don't know how they're feeling now, and the NDP federally probably lost at sea. So it'll be interesting to see the federal responses in the days ahead and how that impacts the federal election, which we can touch on later in the
Well, I was
our
told
little
by
talking.
Blair Qualley, who's longtime representative of the automotive sector, car dealers, basically
Yeah.
today, he told me very gravely that he's been told they're very sure that there will be closures of car plants within a week just because of the disruption caused by the uncertainty. So
Yeah.
this will cease to be kind of simply a news story and become real life for an awful lot of people quite quickly, I'm afraid.
Guests, we started talking last week about nature-based solutions and how Talis is applying the power of their connected technology and experience decarbonizing their own operations to help others embrace more environmentally sustainable practices. It's all just part of Talis's ongoing commitment to social purpose and sustainability. Working with partners, Talis now offers a range of nature-based solutions, including using drones to support the reforestation of areas burned by forest fires, the restoration of coastal kelp, and the growth of mangroves to help sequester carbon. They're also leveraging their own technology to provide reliable impact reporting, creating clear, accountable measures of real impact, like the number of trees planted. That's 12.7 million and counting. The volume of carbon sequestration, which is 1.9 million tons of carbon dioxide just from tree planting, and the total area of ecosystems restored, an overall increase in those areas of biodiversity. We'll come back to this next week, but in the meantime, you can learn more at talis.com/restoration.
Let's get into the topic of the day here, which is the budget. So today's episode is, Jeff and I haven't been in the lockup. We're going to talk about it here. And by the way, Kate's away today, so just be the two of us here chewing things over. No, the first political observation is that because it's coming down today, on the day the tariffs have been announced, it's probably bumped to the number two political story in British Columbia. So the takeaway on the budget is probably not going to be as detailed, as comprehensive as it might normally be, because the media have got to cover what's happening in Washington and Ottawa. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the tariff issue, the silver lining of the tariff issue for Premier Eby has been that it happened because he was facing accusations of drifting, not having a strong strategic program, and he's been able to turn his opposition to the tariffs into a unifying thing that I think has consolidated the support that he had, and made life a little bit more difficult for John Rustad because members of John Rustad's party, but also some of his team have expressed sympathy to Trump quite recently, and some even went to the inauguration. So it's certainly taken over politics, and not in the House. Maybe we'll have to loop back to that a bit and see whether you agree that they're making. I think the Conservatives are doing a better job, maybe superior to what people some expected in question period. But today's budget had a key objective for the Premier and for Brenda Bailey, the finance minister, and that was to demonstrate a pathway to balance. So what everybody was looking for coming in the door is how big is the deficit going to be? Is it 11 billion? Is it 12 billion? Is it some staggering number? Is there a pathway to balance? And I would say on is there a pathway to balance? She showed the pathway to the pathway because she's got a deficit that's below what some people feared. It's I can't remember exactly 10 billion and change, and it continues to be in the $10 billion range, but slightly smaller for the following 2 years of the financial plan. Where there's problems for Finance Minister Bailey is that she's continuing with capital expenditures, most of which have been repeatedly promised at various platforms and are supported by the public, frankly, which she has to build and is going to build, and that's driving up the debt to GDP ratio, which is the other big metric that finance watchers like to watch. So Rustad's team has that target to shoot at, which is that the debt to GDP is continuing to rise, although not out of scope with other provinces. It's much higher than it has been in BC.
Well, I think you're presenting a positive side of the budget today.
That's why am I here?
Why else are you here? I was surprised that at the level of debt that the 3-year plan is showing. The debt GDP is going up to 35%. When John Horgan took office, debt GDP was, I think, below 17. So the debt, and so for those who are hearing debt GDP and don't know what we're talking about, it's just basically the proportion of the public debt to the size of the economy, and is generally a low number is better than a high number. Okay. Now, it is correct to say, our numbers historically been lower than other provinces, but it's catching up. It's catching up. And like BC's has increased, well, let's put it this way. When John Horgan left office, public debt was under $100 billion. And by 2028, it's going to be over $200 billion. So it's increasing fast. It's increasing much faster than the economy is growing. It's increasing much faster than revenues to support it are growing. So by that definition, it's unsustainable. And they've talked about it. I think they raised expectations about a pathway to balance a few weeks ago, or whenever that first came out. And I think it's a pathway over a cliff into a boiling cauldron of red ink.
That's a good talk for the negative side.
Well, what am I here for? So I'm.
Well, I went to the list of. You and I had an interesting conversation with one of the representatives of the road builders in BC, and he pointed out that it's pretty difficult to do any kind of significant road project now for under $50 million, and that's the cutoff at which they start recording them. I went through quickly on especially health and education, not health, but health and the major infrastructure. It's hard to find one there that you would cancel out of a sense of financial prudence because they have all kinds of economic consequences and political consequences. I mean, the hospital commitments include Richmond, Burnaby, Cowichan, St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, either underway or well down the pike, and there's no way they could be canceled. And among the bunch of them, it comes to almost $10 billion or even higher. So we'll see, SkyTrain,
but
TransCanada.
But you raised hospitals, and I'll give you an example. Richmond Hospital was announced, a long time ago for a project of less than $1 billion.
Mhm.
and now it's going to cost over two.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of these other, and I actually went into the budget document, did Command F, and looked for the word overrun. Didn't not mention once in the budget. So value for money and
I
cost
should have done a
control.
search for fiscal challenge. I think that's the euphemism.
But it's like, oh yeah, just because we spend lots on capital doesn't mean we're getting any more of it. It just means we're spending more on these projects than we were expecting to.
Okay,
So
so
how
let's
much?
circle around to the revenue side, because if we had more revenue, then you would be
Then we
more.
could have cost overruns. Is that what you're going to say?
No, you would be more comfortable that it was sustainable. But
Yeah, I would be.
this is a budget that where suddenly nothing happened really, because if it had not been happening against the backdrop of the Trump chaos, we would see that the deficit, as I say, is somewhat higher, not as high as people fear by any means, and it's kind of staying there and declining a bit. But there are no new programs. There are no new tax measures. There's no new revenue measures. There's no new spending for 3 years for many of the key ministries, including education. And I think this is a very big fiscal challenge for the government, which is entirely on its account, which is how does it manage spending in these very, very difficult to manage ministries like education, to keep spending at basically a net zero, same number for 3 years in a row when they have the financial pressures that are out there, including the coming collective agreements. So this is a tough budget. It's really an austerity budget, but
Yeah,
not
conk, conk. It is not an austerity budget.
okay. Why
It
not?
is not an
That
austerity budget.
3 years of
Austerity
no
budget
increase.
is when you are going in and you are cutting and you are making tough decisions to reduce certain things that you just can't afford to do anymore or want to do them differently or or you're laying people off.
Well, that
You
will
know,
all that will happen. All that will happen.
well then we'll call it an austerity budget. To me,
Okay. Well,
this is a keeping
boy,
things level
let's
budget
just note
maybe.
this down. In a few months, we'll be checking in on austerity. This
Well,
is the idea that you could manage this with which is out there, I think, especially on the labor side. This is all manageable with a hiring freeze or this or that. I don't believe it is. I agree with you there, Mike. I think they will have to go
this
deeper
is
than
not 1983 rallies at Empire Stadium.
that was the response to restraint,
Oh
so-called
yeah.
restraint.
Well, that would be
Now
austerity, right?
holy smoke! Now we're really
Or
going into
2002,
no, that was
and
austerity for sure.
breaking union deals. I'm not saying that that's a pathway to success here. I think the courts have weighed in on that,
Well,
but it
since
doesn't feel
Oregon,
this does not feel like a budget that that they're really tightening the screws on spending because
okay.
they're not, right? I mean, they are flattening it,
If you
and
have inflation and other pressures, you don't get an increase. Like in agriculture, there's actually a small decline in the base
yeah,
budget. A lot
education's going to have some tough times ahead. Uh,
citizen services for sure. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. We'll see. I think that the public is going to be fine with this now. They may be unhappy later. And looking where there was increases, they were surprisingly unspecific about the priority for the increased spending. And I would say that about health, where Josie Osborne, health minister, now had to take on mental health and addictions that used to be a standalone ministry. And although there's references to primary care, to recruiting, to doctors, to things like that, there was no direction to say, we're spending this money to make sure that emergency rooms stay open. The minister's been left
yeah.
with either the latitude or the difficulty of trying to deal with all of those issues with whatever she's got.
I've just looked, there's 158 pages in the budget document, and I would say there's about 2 or 3 pages that actually talk about healthcare spending,
Mhm.
as in a focused way. And even then, it's very general. And healthcare spending is 41% of the budget. It's about, I think it's about $40 billion
Yeah, it's a huge
or
number.
somewhere. It's huge, and
Yeah.
it's a budget within a budget. And someone who will remain unnamed said to me, Mike, that's not a hot take for your podcast. And I'm going to say, no, that's a hot take. We need to know more about what's in that black box of healthcare spending. And a lot of that is just basically the provincial government sending money to the health authorities.
Mhm.
But geez, that's a lot of money. Is it being spent well? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But we put more scrutiny, frankly, on the premier's office budget sometimes, which is 17 million, than we do on the $40 billion going into healthcare. So I would say how we talk about these things needs to evolve a bit. and have a little more transparency and more accountability on some of the big things that, really drive the deficit, frankly. And
Yeah, well,
no
you
one
and I
wants to.
talked a bit about permitting in the past, and you made an important point, I thought, recently about speeding up. So one response the premier has made to the tariffs is to take, I think it's 18 projects, or is it 11? I can never remember. Anyway, a number of key
It's
projects,
18, and they're looking for more, they say.
critical minerals and so on, mines for the most part, that they want to speed up. And as you pointed out in a recent pod, you do Indigenous consultation at the speed you do Indigenous consultation. There's no
Yeah,
dial that lets you do it at twice the speed.
yeah,
Not like the podcast where you could leap ahead 15 seconds just by touching a button. So I went to look at that a little bit because water, lands, and resource stewardship, which is where an enormous number of smaller scale permits are issued for everything from mines to you name it, forest, and all kinds of stuff happens there, has not got a budget increase for the next 3 years. Now,
yeah,
I don't know if that's austerity, but it's not that they're not going to tackle the permitting issue by spending more money. Probably fine, but how are that will require a lot of policy interventions then and new approaches with a lot of statutory decision makers and others to get those wheels turning faster. And so then following up on your comment, I went over to look at Indigenous relations budget, and there are increases there. But from the language in the documents, my take was that the reconciliation file is moving very sharply to supporting equity by First Nations in resource projects and that kind of thing. And we're not going to hear very much in the coming period of time about governance or throwing large compensation sums, for example, at Indigenous organizations that have made an important point legally about losses they suffered. So I think there's going to be a lot of cold showers out there in a number of quarters, whether it's people looking for faster permitting or people looking for compensation for losses in the past in the First Nations.
yeah. Well, I think just writ large overall, the choices will get tougher and tougher in the coming years because I think Minister Bailey's going to get serious wake up call when she goes and does the inevitable meetings with the bond rating agencies. They're going to hate this, and we will get downgraded for sure, and we will pay more on our borrowing, which is now increasing. Doesn't seem like a lot, but we're now is the fastest growing expense in government is interest, which is about
Mhm.
7 cents on the dollar now, and it was, 2 or 3 cents not that long ago. So that's billions of dollars, folks. So the sustainability, as I mentioned earlier, is my biggest concern. And, you know, in the next year, I think you've mentioned repeatedly that, there's labor deals coming up. And with the tariffs, that might actually help them negotiate deals that are a little more affordable.
Mhm. I think
One
so.
one point on a labor agreement is $500 million, the budget documents say. So there's a contingency of 4 billion. So every point is, gonna eat into that contingency. Um, anyways, we can numbers. But on the politics of it, um, I felt it just lacked the budget speech and the general approach just lacked a bit of urgency. I just think we're in a moment in history here with the tariffs, with where we're at, and that there was obviously language in there about standing strong and everything, but I just didn't feel the rallying call. I felt it was a little too pedestrian, in terms of what the moment called for.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult when you're in a situation like this that so many doors are closed ahead of time. You've decided not to increase spending for obvious reasons. You don't, that means you can't feature any new programs. And you're not going to go at parts of the electorate and try to get more money from them. There's another problem. And it's also very difficult to forecast improvements in revenue from resource rents, which, us New Democrats always prefer to look the other way on that front. But one of the devastating stories today both inside the budget and outside, is the near-death experience we're seeing in the forest sector, which even before the huge increase in softwood lumber duties that was imposed today, a huge, like doubled or something, we'd already seen a lot of disinvestment, plants close, and so on. As I went in the door, I saw a guy from the forestry sector who said the total allowable cut is going to continue to be quite low. So between the tariffs, the softwood lumber situation, the total allowable cut, Is very, very the revenues from forestry are forecast to be flat when it used to be the iron lung of government revenues.
Yeah.
Same on the gas front. It's coming in with an extra $500 million or something.
Yeah.
But the only bright light there is the LNG plant at LNG Canada 1, which is sorry, first
Yeah.
phase, is going to start to generate some revenues. But there wasn't much discussion about what could happen next on that front.
Yeah, I mean, the budget documents show that natural gas revenues are a bright spot in terms of increased government revenues going forward, thanks to LNG Canada Phase 1, wood fiber, and cedar.
Mhm.
Um, Yet in the budget, not really anything proactive to grow that opportunity, nor was there much really being touted for expediting mining other than what's been talked about in terms of the fast tracking of projects. Yet there was, I don't know, big juicy bone of close to $1 billion for more film tax credits. And
We love our films, or we love their films, the American films. Yeah.
as Don Wright, the Steve Martin of Hotel Pacifico, has said in various writings, that film jobs do not contribute to the economy of BC because they're so heavily subsidized. It's great to have a film job. It's great to have a film sector, but it's not an economic generator relative to some other industries like resource jobs.
Mhm.
And here we are throwing more money into the film sector. Um,
But I wonder, Mike, if it's going to be used. I meant to try to look that up. I mean,
yeah,
what Hollywood producer in his right mind would put up his hand right now and say, "Hey, friends, I found a great place I could go to make films called Canada." Like you would not do that.
yeah.
That would be a good way to get disinvited from a lot of clubs. And so it maybe they put the money there thinking it won't be used. My understanding was that last year a lot of the credit wasn't taken up. But to your point, if that's the case, and I'm not sure that it is, it would be better to say we're leaving it the way it was, and if we think we have a bit of spending room, we'll put it somewhere else where the jobs are going to be more revenue positive. That discussion about the film industry, though, despite Don Wright's best efforts, has yet to be really had in his profits.
Oh yeah, no, it's
It's a sacred cow.
they're a strong political lobby. Let's face it, they get results
Yeah.
at budget time. Um, yeah, there was a minister in the Q&A. The minister was asked about agriculture, and the dirt ministries are all being ratcheted down or at level with previous years. And she used the example of there's exciting things happening in agriculture, including the vertical lettuce business that walks its lettuce over to the Whole Foods. And I'm thinking like, well, that's a great example to share with the sawmilling towns in the interior of British Columbia. We're going to walk the lettuce over to the Whole Foods.
Mhm.
I'm not sure we can build an industry around that or offset the tariffs with that plan, but there will be the harder decisions are upon them. The displacement from the tariffs will be messy, and I don't think the government's going to be making progress until people in the caucus room are mad that they're about the choices they're making. I think you've got to rip off some band-aids and alienate some of your own, not alienate, but upset some of your own supporters to make some of the decisions you have to make, whether it's tough on spending or doing things in certain economic sectors that people would prefer not to do, but you have to. And that's,
I don't see much fun here for any standard NDP supporters. And so it won't be hard to get to that stage. I think the other assumption I'm making about this is that the government's not sure what it'll cost to defend against tariffs because the battle just started today. The contingency reserve, I was curious about your reaction to that. Doesn't strike me as especially bloated or large. I mean, they put they specifically stated that was going to cover off some of the compensation increases for bargaining, which I was surprised because normally I try to resist any indication of a size of a number for bargaining. But but I assume they're going to come back when life becomes a little more clear and maybe even do supplementary estimates. I don't think we've heard the last of this budget. If some of the shocks are as bad as we fear, and the government may have to say, okay, we now have been able to crystallize a proper estimate. So we're coming in for budget approval for a larger deficit to deal with these particular Trump problems. I just don't know how you could begin to forecast it now, and it's certainly not like COVID. So,
Guess another pop quiz from Fortis BC coming to you today. You know, there's nothing more I like to talk about than science. Now, that would be political science, but today I've got some real science, and you're going to have to reach way back to your high school chemistry class for this one. What is the chemical compound CH4 known as? CH4. Any of you know that? Because I know most of you are like me, probably spending more time in arts classes than science classes. But here's a hint. It means this compound has one carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, CH4. And what do you call that? The answer, methane, or most folks call it natural gas. Now, next question. What would happen if we developed a process to separate those carbon atoms from the hydrogen atoms? Well, I personally don't have a clue, but the answer is you would have a process that produces low carbon hydrogen. And that's what our sponsor, FortisBC, who does know a lot about this stuff, is working toward. Last year, FortisBC began testing new technology at one of their sites in the Kootenays with the goal of bringing a large-scale hydrogen production facility to BC. The pilot project was enabled by funding from the province of BC's Clean BC Industry Fund and is a partnership between FortisBC and the Hazer Group, an Australian technology firm. Referred to as the Hazer process, this new hydrogen technology uses a process known as pyrolysis to break apart natural gas into both hydrogen and solid carbon. The hydrogen can then be used in the existing gas system, while the solid carbon could be used in myriad commercial and industrial applications. And it is yet another example of how harnessing the strengths of the existing gas system will support the decarbonization objectives of FortisBC and the province. Innovative technologies such as the Hazer process have the potential to create new economic opportunities. With testing in the Kootenays now complete, FortisBC and Hazer are looking for a potential site in BC for a commercial-scale Hazer hydrogen plant. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Well, we'll see what the public reaction is on it. I mean, I think the prevailing media narrative on the budget so far, from what I've seen, is the rising red ink, the size of the debt, the deficit. There's been a bit of a political mantra among people in different parties, actually, over the last couple of years, that the public doesn't care about the debt, public doesn't care about the deficit, they just care about affordability. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think we're getting to a point where it's going to become a bigger political issue again, but maybe eclipsed by the tariffs in this particular time frame. But when we start seeing some credit downgrades, and I think it's a signpost that maybe things are going in the wrong direction fiscally, that they need to be turned around. But
Well, good luck to the person who gets that
I'm just
job.
an old BC liberal. What do I know?
Exactly. How many times have I heard this song?
Well, it was a nice song for about 16 years.
Oh,
So speaking of free enterprise freedom fighters, the BC Conservatives had a convention this past weekend, which I did not attend, and I do not believe you attended either, Geoff.
no, I'm gonna gleefully offer secondhand information here as opinion and fact. I did follow it as close as I could, and so interested to see a lot of senior journalists here in Victoria did make the trek to Nanaimo to do
Yeah.
some coverage. So I'm not completely without information.
Yeah, Vaughn Palmer made it up there. I had a quick chat with him today, and his column the other day kind of recapped it pretty well. I mean, I think the big takeaway from afar is, there was a little bit of loose talk that, Rustad was going to be challenged. In fact, he was challenged by a dissident group who some wanted him to resign, some didn't want his constitution to pass, some didn't want his executive slate to pass. And, I can't think of a convention I've been involved in where the leader of a party said, I want these people elected on the provincial executive. Usually it happened by stealth, but you didn't actually put it out there that these are my team and I need them elected. And he got them all elected. He controlled the convention. The majority of people backed Aisha Esty as the president, who was part of his team, and a slate of not completely unknown people who were elected to the executive. Some past candidates who, business people, but also one fellow in particular, Troy Lanigan, who someone remembers, head of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who's been outside of party politics for decades. He's back into party politics on the Conservative board. So they brought some interesting people in like that. But I think it's Rustad can kind of check off the box. He got through that test.
Well, I think the timing's good for him. I mean, he had the test, so in my view, it's better to prevail in an unequal fight like that than to not have the fight. And he clearly got his folks in, and that's going to be important to him. I got out a piece of paper that I generated during the right after the election, because I didn't know so many of the Conservatives, and just went back to take a look at their backgrounds, which is interesting too. Like in the list of newly elected first-time Conservatives, there was one lawyer, but there were a number of people who professed, like I don't know if a bunch that I had, 4 or 5 who professed, active involvement in their church. In other words, I'm a lay preacher, or I do lay counseling and so on, which I think is interesting, and I'm sure it'll have its own dynamic in the Conservative caucus. I think it's really a big mistake to uh, stereotype anybody who makes that kind of a declaration, but certainly in other caucuses, you wouldn't have seen that many, in my view. And the lack of professionals in the presence of more people who are in small business and working with their hands is another interesting factor. So I thought it was a pretty good convention for Rustad, and he wound up in the nice position of repudiating, in effect, a lot of the people who had been important to the NDP during the campaign as examples of the reasons you shouldn't support Rustad. So Tim Thielman, who was a pretty important candidate for them in here in Victoria, um, he then got involved in a sectarian internal battle where he was on the losing side. He was at the convention determined to carry on the fight, but looks like he doesn't got a ton of support. I think that's all helpful to Rustad. The question is what he can do in the House now to turn up the pressure. And what I've heard anecdotally since I came to Victoria is that there's a little more discipline and organization occurring on the Conservative side of the House than you might think from reading some of the coverage. They're not in the A team category in terms of question period preparation, but they're grinding it out and will continue to do so.
And they do have people, yeah, I mean, they do have people that are getting some hits. And I talked to a Conservative MLA last night I ran into here in Victoria, and I said, "What's it like in caucus?" And that person said, "Well, it's not unlike any other caucus. There are people that listen, there are people that don't listen. There are people that talk too much, there are people that don't say enough. Like it's, the group dynamics, are probably not that different than a lot of other caucuses. Just that some people may have different views on things that are different than what the BC Liberals were in the past. Um, but the trick will be, can John Rustad bring them into more of a cohesive group going forward, and kind of polish off some of the rough edges. Because, as we had Corinne Kirkpatrick a few weeks ago here, the centrists are there. They're thinking about what they're going to do, what their next move is with BC United / BC Liberals, to be determined
Well, I think you're
over the
seeing
next year.
the NDP is going to fight Trump, and the Conservatives are going to fight the NDP. So one of the statistics I heard was that there were 20 consecutive questions to Josie Osborne on health issues. I think there was one question period where the Conservatives, every single one of them got up and had their own emergency room story to tell. And I think that's logical for them strategically. It produces good content, and in a political environment where everybody's going to get basically overwhelmed eventually by the Trump stuff, hearing that your emergency room was raised to question period may be more valuable than people give it credit for. It's a slow battle, but my sense was that Rustad had a pretty good weekend, and the NDP's having its annual convention. Well, it's not annual; it's every 2 years now. Anyway, they're having one in November. That includes a question mark about whether there's a leadership review. So David Eby's got this to look forward at the end of this year, which has got so many uncertainties and difficulties in it that I'm sure he's not looking forward to it. It's going to be a tough year.
Well, in the past week, in Ontario, there was an election, and Doug Ford prevailed for his third mandate. He'd called a snap election. It worked out very well for him. Do you think that tempts the premier with his precarious majority? Yeah, I guess he technically has a majority. Does that tempt him to go sooner than later?
Well, I think there's a lot of shoulda, coulda, told you so people around who are saying if only David Eby had pulled the plug in May instead of October, it's quite likely he'd be sitting on a much larger majority. So perhaps late at night in his deepest, darkest thoughts, the premier is going, hey, that looked pretty good on Doug Ford. But he's made many, many statements against going in a snap election, and so close to the last one, I think would be risky territory politically. But there may be days when they think it would be a good idea. That's totally different political terrain now, though, and I think the Rustad Conservatives are in much better shape than they were obviously at the start of the last round.
Well, and then federal politics will shape the scenario provincially. this weekend, the federal Liberals elect a new leader, which by all accounts will be Mark Carney, who's expected to win fairly decisively. And then how fast does he go to the polls? And there's a lot of chatter that he will go before the 24th of March, which is when the House has to come back because of the prorogation. And he might short circuit that and just drop the writ. Do you have any gut on what you expect to see on the federal scene?
Well, it sounds right to me. I've been following Carney really with a lot of interest because many people like us who sit on podcasts have been saying it's one thing to be the ideal resume, to be a political leader. It's another thing to actually do politics. And I think we're starting to see some of that difficulty for Carney. He's got a fantastic resume and he's a very smart guy. But this week he was under fire from Stephen Harper for overclaiming his role in managing the fiscal crisis in 2008, that kind of thing. And so, he's doing very, very well within Liberal ranks, but how will he do outside the room? And the other thing I thought was funny this week is that Pierre Poilievre is probably super grateful that Donald Trump picked him out of the crowd and said he's not a MAGA guy, because that's the best possible negative endorsement that Poilievre could get right now. I think he was trailing in Stephen Harper's wake a bit in terms of how firm he was in defending Canada, but having been picked out of the crowd by Trump and redoubled his message on that, I think he's probably going to recover some of his strength. It's very, very tough for the federal NDP, and that will have its own repercussions here, I think. How will Jagmeet Singh be able to get some credit from the efforts that David Eby's making on this front? It's hard to say. And will a Liberal brand resurge enough to even capture some NDP seats? That's a risk, I think, that's out there for BC.
Yeah, there were 14 NDP MPs elected here last election, and that was half their caucus at the national level. Hard to see them electing that many again. In fact, I think they're lucky to win half as many.
Mm-hmm.
Conservatives will chew away at them on the island. The Liberals will hound them, and the Conservatives will hound them in the Lower Mainland. And I think there's a couple seats in the interior that are already probably lost to them. So when the federal election gets going, we're going to think about on Hotel Pacifico how we provide some extra attention to that in the federal race within British Columbia. So stay tuned, hotel guests, for more to come on that. On the federal level, find a federal/provincial story is that we just heard this morning when we got out of lockup that Mike DeYoung was disqualified as a Conservative candidate for the nomination.
Yeah.
And he says on his social media that he was told that he was not qualified to run. And it's like, what do you have to do to be qualified to run as a federal Conservative? Like, he was an MLA for 30 years, finance minister, blah, blah, blah. So Mike is disappointed, obviously, that after spending a year campaigning for the nomination, for whatever reasons, head office has, and maybe they've got good ones, I don't know the story, that's a bitter pill to swallow for him.
Well, beyond bitter, I mean, the question is, as you say, how could that be so? And what's the evidence that they found that's sent him off the field? It raises more questions than it answers. It's inconceivable to me that Mike DeYoung wasn't qualified to run as a candidate. So it must be something rather near term, or that occurred as a result of something that happened in his campaign. Who knows? I'm just dumbfounded by that one.
Maybe he's too stingy. Maybe he was just like,
well, he is very stingy.
He just refused to spend taxpayer money.
He did.
We don't want a guy like that.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, but other people have trouble with it.
Yeah. Well, I am sure we have not heard the last of Mike DeYoung.
No.
Anyways, this was a rather frenetic day for us, Geoff.
Yep.
Being locked up and without our cell phones for 5 hours, so we probably need to go have a drink.
It has come to my attention that I, Gary, the AI-generated voice who shills for air quotes media, am not popular with our listeners on YouTube. Or should I say one listener goes by an alias of cutlery and soiled clothing. Well, suck it, Fork Laundry. This one's for you. Actually, Forky, it's a proposal for everybody, and you're gonna like it. Advertise on air quotes pods, and you can get my nauseating voice off the air. Because your message will be read by one of our influential and human hosts, David Hurley, Kate Hammer, or Mike McDonald. Or just record any piece of creative in your ad agency's fancy production studio and send it to us. Either way, you'll be reaching Canada's most influential listeners at this crucial intersection of politics, and who knows what the fuck happens next. Trump, a new prime minister, new economic policy, a whole new world order. Baby! My data points are tingling! Curse of Politics, the Hurly-Burly, and Hotel Pacifico have the ears of cabinet ministers, elected officials, and the political class, leading journalists, the C-suite, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. Oh, and Curse is going daily for the federal election. Prime influence time. So let's do Forky a solid. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com to get rid of Gary and get your message to the decision makers.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm worried that I might have said this before, but I'm fascinated by it, so I may say it again. This is the second time, I'll apologize to listeners. But one little really off the radar important debate that I've been watching or struggle is the attempt by Unifor to organize the Amazon plant, the fulfillment center in Tsawwassen. And we saw in Quebec that when the Quebec unions were successful in getting a toe in the door there, all the plants in Quebec were shut down by Amazon. And recently, the union here, which had been signing up people for months and months and months, made a number of public statements about how they were being thwarted. This is an interesting strategy by the employer, at least in the union's words, by overhiring. In other words, every time the union turned around, the workforce had a whole bunch of new workers appointed, hired, which then had to be signed up to maintain the threshold necessary to apply for certification. A few days ago, the union basically said, enough of this, it's nonsense, and applied for an imposed first agreement, which is a unique provision in the labor code. It's a kind of a political bomb with the fuse lit being handed to the Labor Relations Board. But if they're successful, and I have no idea if they will be, it could be a huge question mark over so many of the jobs we have from American employers, some of whose top bosses were seated next to Trump at the inauguration. There'll be a lot of repercussions, I think, through a number of these American firms where they're fed up with unionization or whatever they think the problem is, who will, in the current context, maybe just relocate. And in Vancouver in particular, more so than in the interior, when I say Vancouver, I mean the Lower Mainland, there are a lot of jobs that were brought here by Amazon and by others that are really contingent jobs. There's no specific reason for them to be in Vancouver beyond a corporate decision at some level to do so. And I think it'll be very interesting to see down the road how that plays out. We have Microsoft jobs and many other firms that are based there that have put jobs here, which has been very welcome. Will they stay? That's the question I have. And this Unifor issue will be a very interesting example of that.
Well, you raise an interesting issue about big tech and big American corporations that are on both sides of the border. And, one thing government does a lot of and companies do a lot of here in Canada is buy Facebook ads. And billions of dollars is spent on Facebook ads in Canada. The profits are going to the US, and in the process is impacting Canadian media. And the reason they do it is because it's effective. It's Facebook ads are, can be highly targeted. And we talked about this last week when I was bemoaning the loss of the Tri-City News and the Burnaby Now.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is a very tangible action to be taken in the context of this trade war, is considering how we spend in relation to these large companies that we come to rely on. There's a huge transfer of payments that goes from Canada to the US through big tech companies.
Well, I was missing from my comment. I raised my glass to the workers at that Unifor plant who've had the guts to sign up, or at the Amazon plant have signed up with Unifor. But I'll give you another example, and then you can toast or not. I've been running and taking a lot of cabs recently, and met a number of old friends from the taxi industry who I knew from my city council days. One of them had a brilliant idea, I thought, which is to start to toll somehow the the earnings of the Uber industry that are then siphoned off to the United States, because something like 30% of your fare when you pay the Uber driver is going offshore to pay for all of the Uber infrastructure. So we may see some interesting examples like that too. Since the old argument over whether or not the taxi industry could be competitive with ride hailing, I find that the apps work just as well as the ride hailing apps. So who knows?
Yeah,
But
it's a personal choice for people. If you want to take personal action,
yeah.
you've got some choices. You can take a cab instead of an Uber,
Mhm.
and that's you know, that's your choice.
There you go.
Well, as for a mini bar for me today, I'm going to raise a glass to Bridget Anderson from the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade and
Uh-huh.
her loyal stuntman, David Van Hemmen, who was carting around the little coroplast signs at the budget lockup today, which had the report card for the budget. It was a very good visual, very well executed by them both. And Bridget did a ton of media in the budget lockup with her little report card. And
Yeah, what was it? What was
Incidentally, it
it?
was a C minus for the
C minus.
budget from the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. But she gave an F to Trump for the tariffs. So there you go. That's the according to the very tough evaluator, Bridget Anderson. So well done, well executed. We'll
Yeah,
see
well,
if it shows up in the news coverage.
that's a good pick because I think that Board of Trade group with Bridget had done a great job of sort of becoming, in a good way, the preeminent voice of the business community in BC right now.
Geoff, I think the coho is taking off from Victoria Harbor. I can hear that in the background.
Okay, some
Maybe
from
we
the
should
job.
blockade the coho. That might be another trade tactic.
That could be.
No more trips to Port Angeles for anybody. Well, I'd like to thank you, Geoff, for partaking in getting
Thank
me
you,
into the
Mike.
lockup, frankly, with your excellent connections that you have. I'd like to thank both of us for being our own guests today and thank our presenting sponsor, Talis and Fortis BC. See you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.